is Valve pushing game developers to support Proton rather than making native Linux games? Let's talk about this. Now, it might seem ludicrous to a lot of people to hear that Valve, a company that just released all of the details about the Steam Deck, their Linux-powered gaming console, would be reaching out to developers who have already published Linux games on Steam and asking them to remove the Linux game and instead target Proton with their Windows version. But this seems to be actually happening. Noted Linux game developer Ethan Lee, the force behind the FNA game framework and ports such as Fez, Transistor, Celeste, Rogue Legacy, Owlboy, and so many more, recently tweeted this. If you have released a Linux version of your game on Steam and are directly approached by Valve about using Proton instead, please get in touch. DMs are open. They've already done this a few times, but I would like to see how aggressive they're planning to be going forward. Naturally, some people chimed in dismay. Gaming on Linux said this: I really don't get why they would do that. It only increases their own support burden with Proton, and if the Linux port works, well, then it's just pointless. And Joshi added, this is by no means related to any of the work you do, talking about Ethan Lee, and my personal opinion, but there are a lot of game ports that really suck ass, and Proton would be much better given the company has since fired everyone that works on it, or the porting studio doesn't exist anymore. So if it is true that Valve are approaching developers who have already put their Linux client on Steam, and asking them to delist the native Linux client in favor of supporting Proton instead, what does that mean for us? Surely using Proton adds extra baggage and overhead, and native performance of games would be better, right? I mean, right? Not so fast. I think that there are a few reasons that it might seem reasonable from Valve's point of view to kill off native Linux binaries and just go with Proton. Now, I can hear the angry mob in the comments already. I can't believe this fanboy shill is defending the death of native Linux gaming. What happened to the Linux gamer? Now, I am by no means defending this decision, okay? If this is the case, and it still remains unclear if this is true, I simply want to understand it. So let's actually dive into why Valve might consider killing off native Linux binaries through Steam. But first, let's talk about the sponsor of this video, Shells. Shells is your virtual desktop in the cloud. Their service makes your cloud desktop just a click away through any web browser, mobile device, or desktop app. With Shells, you can easily set up your virtual desktop in less than 5 minutes. Seriously, no one can do it faster than Shells. They've worked closely with some of your favorite distributions to deliver a seamless experience from any of their 20 operating system offerings. In addition to Linux distros like Ubuntu, Manjaro, Mint, OpenSUSE, and MX Linux, just to name a few, they also offer Windows and Android images, so developers can test and deploy all from one device. Shells offers transparent, affordable pricing with key features included, like automatic snapshot backups and the ability for you to put your machine in any one of 6 self-hosted data centers. Plus, you can upgrade at any time with just a few clicks to get more power in seconds. Support the show by using the link in the description to take advantage of this great service today. And thanks again to Shells for sponsoring this video. Now, it's been known for a while that running Windows-only video games through Proton on Linux has improved some frame rates in some games. And in some instances, it's even improved stability of the game, you playing the game on Proton versus on Windows. But it's also been noted that running the Windows client on Linux versus running the Linux client on Linux has resulted in one of 3 things. Either marginal performance loss, no discernible difference between the Linux and Windows binaries, or in some extreme cases, the Windows binary performing better on Linux through Proton than the native Linux client does. Now, that might seem a little counterintuitive. Why would running a game through the compatibility layer of Wine result in better performance than running the native Linux client when there's less overhead? It's simple. There really are only 2 reasons for this. The first reason is that the Windows version gets the most development time. And the second reason is that game developers are just simply more familiar with Windows and Microsoft APIs. And I'm not saying they're generally more capable of programming for Windows than they are for Linux. We're talking orders of magnitude. We have to remember that us small Linux niche community, very few people actually use Linux when you compare it to the number of PCs in the world, and even fewer of them develop cross-platform. Now, let's keep that in the back of our mind for a moment and move on to another thing, another reason why Valve is heavily investing in Proton specifically. You probably have a lot of games in your Steam library. I have over 600 in mine, and there are some 10,000 plus titles on Steam. Valve can't sell you a box and say, you can have any game on Steam that you want as long as it's one that has the little penguin badge on the sale page. They can't. I mean, that's literally not an option. They have tried that. They tried that in 2015 and it failed. They put in all this time and effort into the Steam for Linux initiative, the Steam Linux runtime. They developed SteamOS 1.0. They gathered all these OEMs together and foisted the half-baked Steam Machine program on the general public. It was a typically mid-2010s Valve move, if you ask me, relying on third parties to assume the risk of manufacturing the hardware and earnestly believing that the goodwill of the Reddit cult of Gabe would, see them to the moon. But it failed because they didn't think through their program. They didn't consider the fact that it's a pretty hard sell to ask your loyal customers who've spent literally thousands of dollars on your platform to buy a machine that was overpriced, underpowered, and could only play a fraction of the library they already owned. And in reality, it was an even harder sell for Valve to ask PC game developers to bring on new Linux game developer talent when the number of people who would be buying these Linux games would not probably ever justify the cost of hiring these developers. So that's why Valve retooled, and in 2018, they released Steam Play Proton. Proton is a Windows compatibility layer for Steam. It allows all of the Windows games, or many of the Windows games on Steam, to be played through Linux, through this compatibility layer. Proton fills in the gap between x86 assembly and the Windows API calls that the game expects to be there. Things like routines to draw a window to the screen, or play sound effects, or even things like DirectX calls. Proton creates a stable, backwards compatible runtime that games can depend on. And it's a runtime that really doesn't add that much overhead or substantively harm the experience of the game. Meanwhile, some native Linux games have clear problems that many of us are unwilling to admit. Dependency rot. I have several games in my Steam library that used to work great when they were first released, but have either broken in some way, have tons of glitches now, or just simply refuse to boot. I mean, you can no longer play the Johann Sebastian Joust minigame in Sports Friends because it relied on a very specific Bluetooth dependency. Borderlands 2 also has major audio issues. BioShock Infinite also has problems. But then you have developers who have simply ended Linux support for their games. We're talking Rust. We're talking Rocket League. They don't do this to spite us, the Linux community. They do this because the cost of maintaining two separate PC ports of the game is high, maybe unjustifiably so. And especially when the talent to maintain Linux ports just isn't there. Let's also not forget about the myriad of Unity engine ports that get crapped out, left untested, and just put on Steam. They're not optimized for Linux. They just click the little export to Linux button, and they barely work, a lot of them. Let's not try and kid ourselves about any of this. Look, Linux is great for free and open source software. The Linux way, TM, is perfect for FOSS use cases. We build all of our open source software against all of the other latest versions of the dependencies that it needs, the other open source software. This software is maintained and updated by loyal and dedicated communities, people who are passionate about this, and it just works harmoniously in most cases. But you have to admit that the Linux way is actually pretty hostile to proprietary software. If a proprietary dev hasn't bought into this idea of constant iteration and constant upgrade and constant maintenance, well, then they get left behind. Perhaps that's by design. I'm not going to make a value judgment on that because I think that they are two very different use cases for software. But it does result in Linux software preservation looking like digging out an old, Ubuntu disk, running that in like a virtual machine and installing your games that way. I mean, seriously, good luck trying to run any Loki games release on a modern distro. You're not going to do it. We're talking like Heroes of Might and Magic or SimCity 3000, games like this that had a Linux release way back and right now require such old dependencies that it's just not going to happen. You'd have much better luck trying to run the Windows versions of these games through Proton. And that's kind of the point. And look, a lot of these problems Valve have actually tried to tackle with the Steam Linux runtime, right? I've mentioned that a couple times already in this video, but that kind of leads me to my last point. What's the difference between the Linux Steam runtime and Proton? I'm serious. I mean, some people are going to argue minutia on this point, but I don't think that there is much, if any, of a substantive difference between the two. Proton is a collection of software libraries that Steam games depend on in order to be able to run. And the Steam runtime, it's kind of the same thing. But that raises the question, how many runtimes does Steam for Linux actually need? What is the cost of maintaining two separate runtimes for Steam games? Especially when you consider that Steam for Linux currently only has about 2% or maybe even less of the total global Steam user base. And it sucks, but in business, I mean, sometimes it just comes down to numbers. If the majority of game developers, and I mean, I'm talking the vast majority of developers, are proficient with developing with Windows and have almost no experience with Linux, if 80% of the games on Steam exclusively target Windows with absolutely zero indication that that's going to change in any meaningful way, and when only considering legacy titles, something more like 85 or 90% of games support Windows only. If many of the native Linux games get abandoned by their developers and stop receiving updates or provide a subpar experience to end users, thereby negatively impacting the public perception of SteamOS as a platform, and if Proton has negligible impacts upon the end user experience, then it really becomes hard to justify having two parallel runtimes. The continued development cost and maintenance of these two separate runtimes, doesn't it? Just tell a developer who's already published a game on Linux to target Proton instead. Put all your resources behind developing Proton. It makes business sense. The games will work better in the long run, and almost no one will be able to tell the difference. Does that make it right? In 1997 at WWDC, Steve Jobs was asked a question. He was asked why Steve Jobs and Apple had ditched a superior technology in favor of something more mundane. Jobs replied, "One of the hardest things when you're trying to affect change is that the naysayers are usually right about a lot of things. But one of the things that I've always found was that you've got to start with the customer experience and work backwards to the technology. You can't start with the technology and try to figure out how you're going to sell it." As we've tried to come up with a strategy for Apple, we've started with the question, what benefits can we give to the customer? Where can we take the customer? We don't start with, let's sit down with the engineers and figure out what incredible technology we have and then decide how we're going to market that. And it might seem like sacrilege to acknowledge the truth in Steve Jobs' words, especially on this channel. But honestly, that's how the market works. That's how products work. And Linux kind of lives outside of all of that. We're an enthusiast community. We're a bunch of engineers who don't need to worry about marketing or end user experience even in a lot of cases. It might feel good to know that, all of the games running on your Steam Deck are native Linux versions. And because we are the proud Linux papas that we are, we might be willing to overlook the flaws that are there. I've done that. I'm guilty of that super hard. And it might hit the pleasure centers of our Linux brains if Valve were to come out and say, native Linux games only on the Steam Deck. But frankly, if a not insignificant portion of the native Linux games get abandoned by the developer after just a few iterations of releases, or if it adds too much of a development burden for the devs to port and maintain these games, or they aren't familiar enough with Linux to do a good job in porting to begin with, to optimize the game for the Steam Deck, well then the end user suffers. The end user experience is worse. And why would someone buy an inferior product? It's why so many core gamers hate motion controls. It's because the Wii sold on novelty and not on experience. The waggle novelty was accessible for, old people and young kids, but it was an inferior experience. And even though today, when you use motion controls correctly on the Steam Deck, for example, or on the Switch, it's a much better experience than just using an analog stick on its own. Core gamers can't get that bad taste out of their mouth. That's what this is about. This is about having a good experience for the customer. Fact is, like it or not, in most instances, Proton can play the best version of the game. And like it or not, the best version of a PC port of a game is the Windows version. It's the version that the developers spent the most time on, the version that is the most optimized. And look, I'm by no means trying to poo-poo on the work of like Ryan Gordon or Ethan Lee. These guys are some of the standouts in the community, and they support their games for much longer than most other devs who have released a Linux game. I have hundreds of native Linux games in my Steam library, and I would say the majority of them either come from Ryan or from Ethan, but they're kind of islands unto themselves. And at least for now, Valve's not going to convince any publishers, any developers out there to bring on talent for to develop games for an unproven platform. That's the reality of the situation. And it was the reality of the situation with the Steam machines too. It sucks and I don't like it, and I'm not trying to justify it, but I can understand where Valve's coming from here. But before we dig out all of our pitchforks and torches, it's worth considering exactly what we're losing if Valve does go down the Proton-only path. I mean, if Valve kills off native Linux games, what have we lost? Some imperceptible half dozen of FPS? Our dignity? Some would argue that real FOSS enthusiasts wouldn't bother playing proprietary games to begin with. We still have our free and open source systems, We still have the freedom to do whatever we want with our machines. This isn't going to be the end of native Linux anything, except for on Steam. And I think that very little will change for the worse here. I think if the Steam Deck is a success, this could usher in a brand new era, a brand new revolution for Steam games, for Linux gaming. And so I think there's more to be gained than there is to be lost if they go down this road. I know a lot of people are going to hate this video, and that's fine. I want to reiterate that I'm not justifying this course of action. I'm just trying to understand it. And I spent like a good solid 3.5 hours last night writing this 6-page essay, and now I'm reciting it back to you. So if you like this kind of work, if you like the work that I do here, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because it really helps us out. You can hit that like button if you're so inclined. But that's going to do it for now. Thank you so much for watching. I want to thank all of my patrons and my YouTube members. I want to give a special shout out to Marcus Batson, one of my top tier Singularity members over on Patreon. If it wasn't for my patrons and my YouTube members, I would not be able to do this. So thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. If you believe in the work that I do and you want to help support this show, you can head over to Patreon. All of it's greatly appreciated. But that's going to do it for now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys have a blessed day, and I'll see you in the next one.